Hi everyone, today I'm going to be showing you how to create a really simple prop in Photoshop. This is a really simple piece of concept art aimed at beginners to get you stuck into creating concept visuals from scratch in Photoshop. So to get started, open up Photoshop. For the purposes of demonstrating this, I'm just going to click on A4, turn it to landscape and click create. Now, if you're wanting to print this piece of concept art and use it in your portfolios or websites, I would recommend bumping the resolution up to something like 600 at least, as you're going to get much better quality. At this resolution, you will be able to see the pixels. It'll be a little bit noticeable, especially if you printed it. But for demonstration purposes, we'll keep it quite low. I'm going to click on create, and there's my blank template here. So to get started, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to bring in some image references. So I've downloaded an image for a Blender video, which will be uploaded at the same time as this one. And I'm going to drag this in, and I'm just going to move it over to the side of my page here. You see I clicked on the tick there just to place my image. And then I'm going to type Control-T on my keyboard to move it around. Scale it. I'm going to make this image in the middle a little bit bigger so I can use it as a reference. There we go. Okay, so let's get started actually drawing. And to draw this, I'm going to start by blocking out. This is how we start any piece of concept art, whether it's an interior, an exterior, a prop, for film, for costume, anything. We always start by blocking out. And what I mean is basically by making a silhouette. So in the bottom right hand corner, I'm going to click on this little square with a plus icon, and that's to create a new layer. And on that new layer, I'm going to start off with a circle. We've got this big dome right in the center, so I'm going to draw a circle. To do that, on the left hand side, I've got all my drawing tools, and by default, you'll have your shape tool set to a rectangle. If you click on that and hold down, you see we've got the option to add in an ellipse. At the top of the screen, I can change the fill and the stroke, so the stroke is the outline. Whenever you're creating concept art, make sure that you have stroke disabled, so we have a white box with a red line going through. This is so important because when it comes to adding colour and all different textures and stuff, if we've got stroke enabled, it can be a real pain to remove. So make sure that's disabled. I'm going to change my fill to a slightly darker grey. Something like that. And I'm just going to click and drag. And I can make an ellipse, tall or flat. I'm going to hold down Shift so I can draw a perfect circle, like so. And using my Move tool in the left hand side, I'm just going to sort of drag that onto the centre there. Right. The Sneakoscope isn't a perfect circle though. I've got a slightly pointed bottom to this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to chop off the bottom half of this circle and stretch it out. To help me, I'm going to insert a guide halfway on the page. To do that, I go to View at the top of my screen. I'm going to type New Guide, Horizontal, click OK, and I'm going to drag it down. And you can see that it snaps. It's quite subtle, but it snaps when it gets to the center. The reason I've done this is that when I get my marquee tool, which is on the left hand side here, it's the dash rectangle, I can drag that and you can see it goes pink when it hits the guideline, so I know that I'm selecting exactly half of that circle. One thing I need to do is in the layers panel, you can see I've got a square icon on the layer, and this is going to limit how much I can edit it. You'll see this commonly with images that you drag and drop into your Photoshop document. Very easy to get rid of and fix. Right click and go to rasterize layer, and you can see that icon disappears. Now I can edit it and do what I want. So I'm going to drag a selection box over, type Ctrl-J on my keyboard, and you can see that I've got a new layer with just the bottom of that circle. I can then type Ctrl-T to transform that. I'm going to grab this little white box at the very bottom and stretch it out. And you can see that when I do that, it scales the whole object, and of course I don't want that. So to just stretch going down to the bottom here, I'm going to hold down Shift and stretch it out just in that direction, just a little bit. When I'm happy, I can click on the tick, and there we go. Right, so let's get in the trim that we've got in the center there, and I'm going to use the rounded rectangle tool. So back to where our shape icon is on the left. I'm going to go to rounded rectangle, and I'm just going to draw something in like so. And you can see that as I stretch it across, eventually I'll get a pink line in the middle, and that means that's dead center. So I'm happy with that. The one thing I'm not happy with is it's a bit too rectangular. I want it to have more of a curve. So on the right hand side here, you can see that I've got a properties panel that's appeared. All this will edit this rounded rectangle I've made. You see that I've got one option which has the rounded corners. And if I increase this number, let's change it to something like 50 and hit enter. You can see that suddenly it's much more curved. If I zoom in, you can see exactly what that's done. Does that need to be a bit bigger? Yeah, let's make that a smidge bigger and drag it down a little bit. And just hold in Shift, let's just stretch that out a bit. There we go. We've got another trim directly below, so I'm actually going to copy that rectangle, Control J, Control T to move it down, and I'm also going to scale it. To keep it in the center, I'm going to hold Alt on my keyboard. Brilliant, going to click the tick on that. I'm actually just going to use my arrow keys to move that up ever so slightly. Like so. Okie doke. Now currently that trim that I've just added is underneath the bigger one, but in the layers panel it's on top. You need to keep an eye on the order, so I'm going to actually drag that below now. Okie doke. And the last thing I'm going to add is the pivot at the bottom. So I'm just going to grab the circle tool, add a tiny circle at the bottom, Control T to align that up. I'm going to move it up ever so slightly using my arrow keys on my keyboard. And I need to drag that all the way to the bottom because it's underneath everything. So there's my silhouette, there's my blocking. I think the trim actually needs to come out a little bit more, so Control T. I'm going to stretch that out by holding just Alt. There we go. I'm going to do the same thing with the bottom one. Control T and stretch it out using Alt. We use the arrow keys to bring it down a bit, make it a bit more pronounced. There we go. It looks a little too wide as well, so I might actually select the top layer, hold Shift and select the bottom, Control T, and just squish it a little bit. There we go. Right, so there's our blocking. We do that for two reasons. Number one, we just want to focus on shape and form no matter what we're starting off with. Again, if it's an interior, an exterior, or prop, we want to get the form and the shape correct. The second reason is now texturing is really easy. And I'm going to do it the simplest way I know how, which is bringing in photo textures. So, for example, let's add the metallic texture to the trim here. And I can use the eye icon in the layers panel to find which layer's which. So we're going to start off with the big trim at the top. I'm going to go online and find a metal texture. There we go. Go to images. I want a good quality one, so I'm going to go to tools, size and large. And let's select something like this. So let's save that to my downloads, and then I can use that. I've actually downloaded some other textures that I'll use. So let's get this one. I'm just going to drag and drop. It's huge, so I'm going to hold down Alt to scale that down quickly. And let's position that so it's covering the whole trim. Click on the tick. I'm also going to reduce the opacity of this layer so I can see the image below. And to do that, I just go to opacity here in the top right of the layers window. I'm just going to bring that down a little bit, and then I can position that a bit better. I'm also going to go to Control T and hold Shift and just squash it a little bit to get a bit more of that texture in. There we go. Now at this point, some of you may start rubbing it out or, cutting bits off, and we don't want to do that because that's what's called working destructively. And that's something you don't want to do if you want to pursue concept art in the industry. You want to work as non-destructively as possible. You want to keep as much of the original image as you can, so that further down the line when things need to be edited or changed out, it's easier for you to do so. So for example, instead of rubbing out the bits we don't need on this image, what I can do is simply right click on it and go to create clipping mask. And what that does is basically the rounded rectangle underneath. The only bit of the texture we can see is what's on top of that, rounded rectangle, sorry. So let's bump up the opacity again. And let's do the same thing for the trim underneath. Let's select that layer. We can use the eye icon to make sure we have. Drag and drop that texture on. Hold down Alt to scale. There we go. I'm going to squash it to get a bit more of that texture in. And then right click on the layer, create clipping mask. And there we go. Okay, nice and easy. Going to do the same thing for the pivot at the bottom, so select that layer, drag the image in, Alt to scale quickly. I'm going to bring that right down. Whoops, not that far down. Not even going to bother squashing that because we barely see it. Right click, create clipping mask, and there we go. Don't worry about light and shadow, we're just getting texture on for now. Let's get the graphic that we want to use on the main body here, and that's this layer, and I've already downloaded a texture for that. I've brought in this one, and I'm going to drag that over, tick to confirm that, right click and create clipping mask. You can see how much easier texturing is because we've created our blocking layer. I'm also going to type Control T on this texture. Even though it's clipped, I can still move it around and reposition it if I want to. So let's say I want it there. For the glass at the top, I'm actually not going to texture that. I'm going to paint. I'm going to use a soft brush to just paint it in. So I'm going to select the dome on the top, which is this layer. Add a new layer on top, right click and create clipping mask. So that's a blank layer that's clipped that we can now paint on. It'll do the same thing. We can paint all outside the lines, but we'll only see the paint that appears on top of the dome. So let's get our paintbrush tool. Let's go to the paintbrush icon at the very top of our screen. And let's go just to general brushes and get a nice smooth brush like so. I'm going to make it pretty big, about sort of 1000. I'm going to select a very light grey from the right hand side here. I'm just going to start painting that over. I've actually got my opacity quite low at the top here. I'm going to bump that up. There we go. Might make that a little bit brighter. There we are. Okay, let's add a bit of light and shadow to this whole model now. Let's make it look a bit more three-dimensional. So I'm going to keep that soft brush, but I'm going to bump the opacity right down to about 20%. I'm going to select black from the colour menu, and I'm going to add a new layer, right-click, create clipping mask, so it's just applying to the dome on the bottom. And I'm just going to very lightly add some grey shadows to the left, to the right there. And I'm going to add a little bit darker on the right. You can do the same thing, but with white. I'm going to do that on the left. Okay, I'm just using a mouse for this. Okay, no fancy equipment. If you do want to use a drawing tablet, it is a lot easier. but don't think that you need to. There we go. I'm just going to move that around. Brilliant. I'm happy with that for now. Might get the rubber tool, get that same soft brush, bump it up. Whoops, not that much. And then just take it back in the center a little bit. There we go. Okay, nice and simple. So let's do the same thing with the base. That's probably the easiest one to start off with. New layer, right click, create clipping mask, get our paintbrush, set it to black, and let's add a bit of shadow onto the right hand side here. And we're also going to make the brush a little bit smaller and add some shadow underneath that trim there, as we logically would. There we go. And I'm just going to bump that brush back up and add a little bit more to the bottom. There we go. Same thing with the highlight. Bump up the brush size. And we'll just start putting that in. Okay, nice and simple. Let's do the same thing with the trim. So let's find that. So there's the top one. Apply the layer to the top of the texture. Right click, create clipping mask. Get the black and just sort of shade that in. I'm imagining the light's coming from the left. So just bringing that in. Let's change it to white now and drag that across. Let's do it for the lower one. New layer, right click, create clipping mask. And make this slightly darker because it's underneath. Less of a highlight. And now what I need to do on this one is, because that top trim will cast a shadow, I need to get a smaller brush, set it to black. I'm just going to drag it along like this. And this is also going to help differentiate between the two. There we go. We'll add a little bit of a highlight to the bottom so it's not completely kind of lost. There we go. And same thing with the top. A bit of a highlight. Then a shadow. Definitely a highlight at the top. Not going to spend too much time on it because I don't want the video to be hours long. Let's get a nice big brush back and bring the shadow back on the right there. And let's maybe just add it on the bottom as well. There we go. Now, one thing I might do just to make this look a little bit more realistic is add a bit of a really strong highlight. And to do that, I'm going to add a new layer. And I'm going to use a new tool on the left hand side here. It's the third one down and it's the lasso tool. By default it will probably be set to this. But click and hold down and select the middle option, which is the polygonal lasso tool. And this is basically a selection tool. So I'm just going to click and go across like so. And drag a bit of a highlight like this. If I zoom in, I'm now going to get my paint bucket tool, which is in the middle of the tool set on the left, set it to white, and I'm just going to fill that. To get rid of the selection, just get your Magic Wand tool, right click and deselect. And you can see I've got this really harsh kind of glossy metallic highlight. It's not that realistic. We're going to do a couple of things to this first. I'm going to get the Magic Wand tool, I'm going to select everything but that white highlight. Okay, so I'm just going to click outside. And I'm going to right click, I'm going to go down to the option where it says feather. And this is going to blur the edges. So when I click on that, I get an option to decide how many pixels blur out. So in this instance, I'm going to blur 2 pixels. All depends on the ratio that you decided at the start, what resolution, how big's your canvas. So this is a bit of trial and error. I'm going to type 5, see what we get with that. Click OK, and I'm just going to hit delete on my keyboard. And you can see it starts to blur out. Out. Okay, it's a little bit too much, so I'm going to undo that. Right click, go back to feather. Is there anything else? And in this case, I'm going to type 3, click OK, and hit delete on my keyboard, and that's a little bit better. Okay, it's a little bit more realistic. I'm also going to play around with the layer mode to see if I can get a bit more of a realistic light. So zoom in by pressing Ctrl and then plus on your keyboard. And where it says normal in the layers panel, that's your layer mode. And when you open it up, you get a whole list of different options. And this is going to determine how the light interacts with the layers below it. So for example, if I go to overlay, you can see a bit more of the texture comes through. And let's scroll through, let's see what we can get. Let's go for overlay, actually, we want a bit of that texture in. And lastly, I might just slightly reduce the opacity of the layer so it's a lot less harsh. And there we go, we've got a little bit of a highlight there. Okay, so we're just going to add a bit of light and shadow to the ellipse. So soft brush again, new layer. Reduce the size of it, set it to black to add our shadow, and then a bit of a highlight, like so. Nice and simple. And already it's starting to look pretty good, it's a nice little concept as it is, but there's a few finishing touches we can add to really make this, stand out, to really make this pop. The glass isn't looking that great, I want that to look a little bit better. First thing I'm going to do is let's get rid of the reference image. And then now let's select all the layers in our layers panel by holding shift and selecting them all. And you see at the bottom of my screen, I've got a little folder icon. If I click on that, it puts everything into a group. So now everything in there is one big group. I can type Ctrl-T and I can move that maybe more into the center of my image. Let's get rid of that guide as well. Let's go to View and Clear Guides. Right, what are some of the things we can do with this? Well, we can add some reflections, we can change the contrast, we can add a bit of blurring, we can do all sorts of things. First thing I'm going to do is copy that group, so I'm going to type Ctrl-J, right click on that group, and I'm going to merge it. And that basically gives me a JPEG to work with. That's really useful because I've now got a group with all the individual layers in if I need to edit anything. But I've now got a flattened image which I can use to make editing a little easier. So let's first of all go to Filter, Render, and let's go to Lens Flare. And when we open this, you see we get this groovy little window, we get a brightness slider, and we get some lens types. What you can actually do, you'll see that there's a tiny crosshair in this preview, and you can click and drag that around. And you can see I've got a lens flare, I've got a light source. So I can click on that, and I'm going to use this to make my glass dome look a little bit more realistic, look a little bit shinier. So I'm going to move my reflection there, click OK, and you can see suddenly it looks a little bit better. I'm then going to get my rubber tool, bump the opacity about halfway and start rubbing out what I don't want. So I'm going to get rid of the lens flare on the right hand side here. There we go. So now I've got a nice bright intense highlight on the surface here. To make this look more like glass, I'd put a background in so that you can see it's transparent. However, just to keep it nice and simple for now, I'm going to leave as is. Right. Let's do the same thing again. Let's go to Filter, Render and... no, not Fibers. Filter, Render and Lens Flare. And I'm going to drag one in on the bottom, like so. Just to highlight that a bit again, and I'm just going to rub back where I don't want it. Oh, and I get a little unwanted one in the top right there. And I want to put a little highlight here. Now I've rubbed out too much of the image to add a highlight, so I'm just going to copy that group again, right click and merge it. And I'm going to drag this to the top. Hides everything I've just done, but don't worry about that. Filter, Render and Lens Flare. Let's add one just on the bottom corner here. Let's bring the brightness down. Click OK. And then let's rub out to reveal the highlight that we just added. The highlight on the bottom. There we go. And I can even reduce the opacity just to take that intensity down a little bit. Okay. So there's our image done. Let's add a little bit of background stuff, add a new layer. Let's get my brush, set it up quite big, something like that. Set it to black, bump the opacity up, put a splotch there. Control T, let's flatten it all down. So we've got a little bit of a shadow on the base there. Brilliant. I'm going to reduce the opacity as well so it's a little bit grayer, a little bit more subtle. And then let's add a bit of a background. So let's just get the rectangle tool, set it to a darkish grey. Let's see what we get with that. Ooh, a bit too harsh. Let's change that to a lighter grey. That's a bit better. And then quite a cheap little presentational thing. Let's get our soft brush again, bump it up, bring the opacity down to about 20, and then just add a bit of shading in the corners, which just draws our focus into the centre. Helps make our image stand out. Okie doke. So there we have it. It's a nice little intro project for those of you who are unfamiliar with Photoshop. Gets you accustomed to layers and to using various bits of the tools. And then as you get more advanced, what I'll do is I'll redo this project and create a more realistic version so that you can kind of be eased into it. But there we are. There is how to create a prop in Photoshop.